Oh, hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we continue in our study, verse by verse, chapter by chapter, and book by book study through the entire Bible. We are currently in Luke chapter 16, but I inadvertently did something here that I'm going to quickly go back and do. Because as I said before, chapters 15 and 16, and really the beginning of chapter 17, really should be one chapter. And the reason why is, let me do this right quick, because I want to see, excuse me, every thought that Jesus has been saying, everything that he's been saying, stems from one thought. And the reason why I'm also doing this, this is kind of a good object lesson, excuse me, in Bible study and Bible interpretation. And that's important because oftentimes when we talk about the biggest mistake that I see in Christianity is people who will let's see here. They will take scriptures, passages of scriptures, and string verses along. And when they do that, they miss the meaning. Now that's okay. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. I'm not saying that you should never have topical studies and things like that. And I think I spelled hearts wrong. Okay. I didn't proof my thing here. God knows our hears. Wrong spelling, should be hearts. Okay. But just like in the 15th chapter, when we talked about the prodigal son, and the story of the prodigal son is not about the prodigal son. By the way, the word prodigal means wasteful son. That's basically all it means, wasteful son. The word prodigal, people think means kind of an estranged, but actually just simply means wasteful. And the prodigal son, the story of the prodigal son, is about the other son. And let me show you this here. And I want to read this. Verse 1 says, all the tax collectors and sinners were approaching to listen to him, and the Pharisees and scribes were complaining, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And by the way, this is Luke 15:1. So these two chapters, this is what Jesus has been addressing. This is what all these two chapters is about. Every story, every parable. He's responding to that statement, their criticism that he eats with sinners. And there are a lot of layers right there, because the Pharisees, of course, being hypocrites, fail to realize how they themselves are included in that. Of course, the other problem is they themselves think that they're not. They think they're not. Or they think that the sinners are not worthy of God's love and mercy. All right, so let me read this again, and then we will go into Luke chapter 16. Let me read this again. It says, all the tax collectors and sinners were approaching to listen to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes were complaining, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. Now, I'm going to go to, this is Luke chapter 16. He says, he also said to his disciples, so this is a continuation. Now, let me also say this again, that chapter headings and verses are not inspired. God, when God inspired the writers to write the letter, they wrote in a story, narrative form. They didn't write in verses, and there's a big problem with chapter and verses. This is a good example of it. Because we miss what God is saying, and I can't stress that enough, that we cannot stress the fact that God is communicating something, and the flow of thought here, okay, it's important. All right, so in verse 1 he said, he also said to his disciples, there was a rich man who received an accusation that his managers were squandering his possessions. So he called the manager in and asked, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you can no longer be my managers. Now, in some of your translations, I think the old King James says steward. It will use the word stewardship. Okay. So go back. All right. Verse 3. Then the manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm too strong. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I should do. When I'm removed from my management, the people will welcome me into their homes. And so he summoned each one of his master's debtors. How much do you owe my master? And he asked the first one. 100 measures of oil, he said. Take your invoice, he said. Sit down quickly and write 50. Next he asked another, how much do you owe? 100 measures of wheat, he said. Take your invoice, he told him, and write 80. And the master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted astutely. For the sons of this age are more astute than the sons of light in dealing with their own people. That certainly is true. I digress. Verse 9. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous money, so when it fails, meaning the money, they may welcome you into eternal dwellings. Verse 10. All right. The kind of people get kind of curious about this. They get kind of curious about this parable here. The parable, remember, is in response to the Pharisees, the leaders, the stewards of Israel. To keep that in mind. This is always remember that the parables and the stewards, always keep this in mind, that they are, the symbols, I should say, are they're the continuity. Okay. The leaders of Israel are called in the Old Testament shepherds, stewards, we translated managers. In that present, the Pharisees were the stewards. However, they wasn't appointed by God, but stewards nevertheless. Now, he tells this story about, and again, remember parables, the parables are not necessarily to be followed in every detail. However, the truth of the parables is always consistent and clear. So he tells us the story about an unjust or wicked manager. And so he's cheating the people. Right? He's cheating the people. He was squandering his possessions. and thus he was cheating. And so he said, "You're getting ready to get fired." So he thinks to himself. He says, "Wow, I'm getting ready to get fired. What am I going to do?" All right. So he says, "I can't beg. I'm ashamed to beg. I'm not strong enough to dig." Okay. And if we really want to pull this apart, there's a lot there we can take about poor decision making. In other words, he's getting ready to get landed. He's going to land himself in a situation where, okay, dumb decision. Okay. So he says, okay, he devised a plan, and he says, okay, now, mind you, he probably has a bad reputation, and in fact, this is somewhat what the tax collectors would do, that they would overcharge to people, and there was nothing you can do about it, and the tax collectors were very hated people. They were hated worse than the Pharisees, you know. But anyway, so he says this evil manager. He says, "Okay, man, I'm gonna get put out, and it's gonna go bad for me." So what's the moral story that Jesus is saying here? Make friends. So what does he do? He says, "How much do you owe my master?" "Oh, I'll owe him 100. I tell you what, let's settle your debts for 80. Now, he probably should have only charged him 80 in the first place. So to the people, they're thinking they're getting a payoff. You know, it's kind of like when you guys fall for the marketing, like furniture, right? When the furniture store tells you that, hey, you know, this $1,000 couch, we're gonna slash it half price. It was half price in the first place, right? You're just being overcharged. Same thing with cars, right? One of the biggest rip-off, house mortgages, interest rates, compound. Whoever thought about that? Wow, compound interest, right? These are things that as consumers we're being taken advantage of all the time. So any kind of time you see a sale, anytime you see a sale, even so-called closeout sales when stores are closing, you don't get that great of deals, right? But anytime you see that, you know that what? If a store could cut prices for 50%, we're not realizing we're being overcharged 50 cents in the first place, 50% in the first place. All right, so yeah, there's just no really big deal with that. Okay, so he says, okay, he goes to each one of the customers, and he says, hey, you know what? And he starts slashing their prices. So the manager goes, that was actually kind of a wise thing. And the point that Jesus is making, though, is that, you see, that was a shrewd move, because he's getting ready to face these people whom he's overcharged. Now, relate this back to the Pharisees. The Pharisees had been ruling Israel, taking advantage, and what he says is now, and actually you can say, even speaking to Israel, you better make friends, okay, with this world whom you're getting ready to face, right? You should be making friends instead of despising them. All right. Verse 10, if I can find it myself. All right, it says, whoever is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. Whoever is unrighteous in very little is also unrighteous in much. So if you have not been faithful in what is with the unrighteous money, who will trust you with the genuine? And if you have not been faithful in what is belongs to someone else, who will give you what is your own? No household slave can be the slave of two masters. No household slave can be the slave of two masters, since either he will hate one and love the other, or else he would be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot be slave both to God and money. You cannot be slaves to God and money. Okay. Now, the Pharisees, let me read this up because he actually getting ready to blast the Pharisees here. Because why is he saying this, right? Think about this for a moment. Why is he bringing this up about money in the very next verse 14? The Pharisees were lovers of money. The Pharisees who were lovers of money were listening to all the things and scoffing at him. And he told them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your hearts. For what is highly admired by people is revolting in God's sight. This is a big clapback. Now, here it's an interesting thing here. Now, remember, if you were sitting in the audience, the common people, you may or may not know that about the Pharisees. Just like many preachers today, although sometimes I think it's quite evident they are lovers of money. They're just shrewd enough to think people are stupid enough to buy their schemes. And sadly, many are. When a man can sit up and tell you, when two men can sit up on a television program and boast about their Lear jets, their multi-million-dollar Lear jets, and then tell you, well, we're privileged. We have to have that because we hear from God. We need a Lear jet, a multi-million-dollar Lear jet. We need that in order to hear from God, and people send the money in. When preachers can tell you, and they have, that we can't stand in lines like y'all. We're preachers. We're God's servants. We're God's anointed. And they actually say this to people. They say this to the congregation. We need these Lear jets because after all, we're doing the Lord's work. We can't be standing in lines and going through security checkpoints and like y'all, like the common people. Of course, one minister got in trouble, and I think it was more of a he didn't mean it the way it sounded, but he was like, you cramped up. You're cramped up in a tube full of demons. Now, he didn't mean the people, and when I heard that, I knew he didn't mean that. It came out wrong. My point is, the point that you still thought you was too big, you're too good to be, you're too good to be in the plane with common folks. By the way, as if demons can't be in your plane. But I digress here. I certainly digress. The point is, my point, you don't see that, however. You don't see that. They look holy. They look like men of God. They look like they're anointed. Right? They do. And so we get this. Notice he says the Pharisees were lovers of money. This is why Jesus is saying this. Their whole motive, see, wasn't holiness at all. They were lovers of money. So he says right here, the Pharisees who were lovers of money. Now, and then he tells them you can't be a slave to God or a slave to money. He's speaking to them. Notice they start scoffing. Now, as one parable says that if you throw a rock into a pack of dogs, the one that yelps is the one that got hit. And they were yelping. These guys were yelping a lot. You see, the idea is that they, Jesus exposing their hearts. All they were just greedy people. And that's why he told this parable. And then he also tells them this, that look, you better watch how you treat people. It's this saying, the people you mistreat going up are the ones you have to kind of greet coming back down. Verse 14 again, the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things and scoffing at him. And he told them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the sight of God. In the sight of others, but God knows your heart. Now, it's kind of amazing that people hear this a lot. Well, God knows my heart. Jesus knows my heart. Yes, he does. And that might be your biggest indictment, because he does know your heart. And by the way, whatever's in your heart, it's going to come out. See, if it's in your heart, it's going to show. It's going to reveal itself. And he says right here, again, verse 15 again, and he told them, you are the ones to justify yourselves in the sight of others. But God knows your hearts, for what is highly admired by people is revolting in God's sight. So, one of the things you see, even sadly in churches, you see men and women patting each other on the back, praising each other, esteeming each other. God says that's the revolting in God's sight. Vainglory. All it is vainglory. Alright, verse 16. The law and the prophets were unto John. Since then the good news of the kingdom of God has been proclaimed, and everyone is strongly urged to enter it. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of the letter in the law to drop out. Now, I'm going to go back and give you a little Bible study principle here, a little Bible study nugget here. He says, the law and the prophets were unto John. You may want to take that as a note when you're reading prophetic scriptures, the books. Especially when you hear people today trying to put prophecy together today. John was the last Old Testament prophet, John the Baptist. If you kind of go back and you look at prophecy, excuse me, the reason why John is the last, and by the way, let me use Daniel's 70 weeks. Daniel's 70 weeks. The 69th week of Daniel, it says the 70-week prophecies were a timetable. It is 70 sets of 7-year periods of time, totaling 490 years. That was the prophetic timetable, 490 years. He said that timetable started when Cyrus the king issued the proclamation for Jerusalem to go back and start rebuilding the kingdom. That happened around, in the book, if you look at the books Ezra and Nehemiah, that's when that decree happened. That's also when that 490-year prophetic clock began. Now, the issue with the problem with prophetic time is it is not necessarily consecutive time as we see, because in the 69th week, that brings us to the year of Jesus. The 8 right here, that's this period here. In other words, prophetically, and prophecy is always, you can chart yourself. You can say, where are we in prophecy? And one of the most, and so you get like Jeremiah was able to chart himself. He was able to locate himself in prophecy. He was reading, and the reason why that 70-week prophecy came about, because he's reading the prophecies of Jeremiah, and he says, "Oh, 70 years are almost up. God had decreed 70 years for the captivity of Jerusalem, or the Israelites." And he's reading, he says, "Oh, this is almost up." If you were reading in the Medes and Persian times, you're able to go, okay, this is the time period we're in. If you was in the Grecian kingdom, then all of a sudden you're witnessing the events of Alexander the Great, and when he passed away, his kingdom was divided among his 4 generals. You'd be able to say, oh, I'm locating myself in prophecy. So when we get to this period of time here, John the Baptist, Jesus, the apostles, if they were astute, could have located themselves and said, we are in week 69. Okay? So if you're looking at it prophetically, John was the last Old Testament prophet before the Messiah comes. Now the Messiah did come. So what's next? Okay? What is prophetically next? So John ended the Old Testament prophecy because then Jesus did come, except you have a couple other things that's going on, what's called the near and far revelations, fulfillment of prophecy. Well, Jesus came, that fulfilled. So in the sense, we're no longer under the Old Testament. What's next? Well, we're waiting for Jesus to come. But there's been this 2,000-year gap, and that's called the church age, which we're not going to get into, but the church age. So he says it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of the letter in the law to drop out. Jesus would fulfill that. That's what he is saying right here. Verse 10, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery. And everyone who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. Now, why is Jesus saying this right here? Why is Jesus saying this here? Think about this. Why is he saying this? He's really exposing the Pharisees. This is what the Pharisees were doing. Now he cites the law in terms of divorce. And unfortunately, notice what he says, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. By the way, when he says everyone who marries his wife, everyone who divorces his wife, and then of course, what the reason for divorce, you can say, other than adultery. Everyone who divorces his wife, other than adultery, Jesus is just not taking the time. This is a clapback. He's exposing the Pharisees because this is what they did. So everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And everyone who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. Right here, and we're going to leave it at this because, of course, this is a kind of a passing statement that Jesus made, kind of an insult, not an insult, but he's exposing the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. They were doing this. And remember, they asked Jesus a question once, that could they divorce their wives for any reason? They had the audacity to say that for any reason. Any reason. Hey, Jesus, any reason can we divorce our wives? For any reason. Well, this also brings up a very interesting thing here. On what basis is marriage godly marriage? And that is not dependent upon the culture. And that's important because, you see, in the culture today, this is what people are doing. Now the reason why Jesus was saying that is the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. People in the church are doing this today. And it makes this a very awkward conversation with a lot of people. It makes it very awkward. Because there are people who I know, who are getting divorced, and they get divorced in an unbiblical way. So where did that leave them? Jesus just told us. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Now, there's a couple of things to realize here. You're committing adultery. If you are married in a biblical way by God's standards and you divorce your wife, we got to put this in under the law as Jesus is teaching here. The New Testament has a different standard. We won't go there now. I've dealt with this before. But just under the law of Moses, if you divorce your wife for any reason other than adultery, that is unbiblical. Then if you go and marry this person, this is what Jesus is saying. You are committing adultery. In other words, you're still married in the eyes of God. In the eyes of God. So the question is then, right? So if I divorce my wife and I go marry someone else, I'm committing adultery. In God's eyes. You know, I remember it's kind of funny because people used to say this about shacking up. You don't hear too much about it these days, but you know, that's back when I was younger. You heard a lot about shacking. People started in the 70s, the 60s, the 70s. I was a teenager in the 70s. But you hear people saying that they would shack up. And then people would say this. They would say, well, I know in the eyes of God we're married. Now, I wasn't a Christian, of course, so I couldn't reply like I'm getting ready to reply. Had I been a Christian, I would have said, no, you're living in sin. You're not married. You're living in sin. See, in other words, just because we're doing something, and even, so put it like this, it could even be a sad case where you're even happier in this relationship. But that doesn't mean that it's right. And by the way, I'm going to tell you, godly marriages are all reconcilable. So with that, like I said, I'm not going to get into it now, but all marriages are reconcilable. Okay, so we'll pick it up with this in our next study. And all right, guys, look, we just picked up. Yeah, we just picked up the next study. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Till next time, I'll see you then. All right.